At the time of my arrest, I was chairman of the board and CEO of Renault. I was also chairman of the board of Nissan and chairman of the board of Mitsubishi. I never felt threatened. From 1999 until 2018, I was something of a role model in Japan. A lot of books had been written on me. I was invited to all the universities, so I had no reason to be worried. I landed at Haneda Airport and arrived at the terminal in passport control, as usual. The person checking the passport tells me, "It seems there's a problem with your visa." And he asked me to go with him to the room next door. And then a person came over and introduced himself as being from the Tokyo prosecutor's office. He said, "Mr. Ghosn, we have a few questions for you." And he told me I couldn't use my phone anymore. I left in a car surrounded by people from the prosecutor's office. I felt like I was in a movie. I was in shock. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't understand. And they took me straight to the detention center. What struck me most was the isolation, the silence. It was the usual routine. I mean, they take all your personal effects. They strip you of everything, even your watch. You aren't allowed to keep anything. You have to get undressed. They give you a prison uniform. And then they take you to a cell without any explanation. I was trying to understand the situation I was in. I was struggling with that. You have nothing. You have no sense of time because you have no watch. You have no means of communication. You're not allowed to write anything down. You have no paper. You have no pencil. Nothing. I remember it was very cold. It was a Monday night. November 19th. It was very cold, and that was that.
For Carlos Ghosn, Japan was a sanctuary. He's perhaps not universally loved around the world, but in Japan he was. I was in Yokohama that very day. It was the same for me as it was for everyone close to him. Everybody distanced themselves radically. Anything to do with Carlos Ghosn felt like it was potentially contagious or dangerous. So it had to be quarantined. Saikawa spoke. He's not someone who's particularly comfortable speaking publicly. But this time, he was strangely well prepared, and he just destroyed him.
We regret to announce that Mr. Carlos Ghosn, chairman of the board of Nissan, has committed embezzlement, which was revealed through an internal investigation. The accusations are as follows. He has lied to the Tokyo Stock Exchange police by declaring his compensation was much lower than the actual amount he received.
You could feel that there was a lot of careful planning behind the arrest, and that the company was cooperating with it, and even driving the arrest itself.
And lastly, he used Nissan property for his personal use. Our investigation has revealed some clear misappropriations.
And for him, there was no shadow of a doubt. Just a few hours after his arrest, Carlos Ghosn was guilty as charged.
The lesson we must take from the dark Ghosn years is that power should not be concentrated in the hands of one man.
It only took a few hours for the charges against Carlos Ghosn, the star boss of the car industry, to be revealed. If money was his guilty pleasure, now it was his downfall. But if he was such a greedy man, why was that? What drove his ambition? Who is Carlos Ghosn? From Beirut to where he fled from Japan and its justice system, Carlos Ghosn has agreed to look back on a 40-year-long career during which he built up an empire over which he ruled supreme.
The Renault-Nissan merger has finally happened.
The alliance is now sealed between the French and Japanese manufacturers, Renault and Nissan.
A global partnership deal was signed this morning in Tokyo between Louis Schweitzer and the boss of the Japanese company. This new group will be the world's fourth largest car manufacturer.
Tomorrow, Carlos Ghosn, the number 2 at the French firm, will arrive in Tokyo with a mission to restructure Nissan, which is accumulating huge debts.
There's something very seductive about Japan. The organization, the cleanliness, discipline, punctuality, the sense of community. As a great lover of cultural diversity and someone who's fascinated by new languages, new cultures, and new stories, I was delighted to come to Japan. When I arrived, Nissan represented the most traditional side of Japan. I arrived at Nissan's headquarters, and nobody spoke English. And this is a company that was already established all over the world.
It was perfectly logical for me to send Carlos Ghosn there. His cost-cutting capabilities were what we needed back then. I wouldn't have done the Nissan deal if I couldn't have sent a Carlos Ghosn there.
Nissan was selling 2.5 million cars, with an operating margin of between 0 and 1%. They were in the red. The Nissan brand had absolutely no prestige. There was no focus on market need. And what's more, they had a debt of $20 billion. The company was on the edge of a precipice. They called me the cost killer. They couldn't picture what a guy from Renault could do for a company like Nissan.
I thought they had sent Mr. Layoffs. I knew that he had closed factories and laid off hundreds of workers at Renault. I was sure that at Nissan, he was going to close factories, slash budgets, and apply the same restructuring methods as he had done in France.
We didn't come as prophets or messengers. Absolutely not. We were pragmatists. I said we had to be like doctors. We go in, we examine, we see what's not working, we treat, we help, and then we teach them how to look after themselves better. And we go on to the next one. That's all. I took 3 months to set up the Nissan revival plan. Not long. I left time for discussions, and then I made my decision.
Thank you, Haneda-san. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As promised, I'm here to communicate to you the Nissan revival plan.
I felt that he was very strong. He was full of energy.
Nissan points to one reality. Nissan is in bad shape.
His face was scary. His eyes were piercing. His voice was loud.
This means a 21,000 headcount reduction, or 14% of total employment.
We went from 140,000 employees to 115,000. At first, people said it was terrible. We were killing people's jobs. When you restructure a business, the restructuring by itself doesn't make sense. Its purpose is to find new areas for growth. You put people into early retirement and you close factories so you can free up resources to reinvest in the future. I don't know of anyone who has returned a company to growth without first putting their house in order. If you don't care about the future, you don't have to lay people off. You just wait for death to come naturally.
After just 1 year, he presented positive results for Nissan. He announced profits of $1 billion, and I was very surprised.
In 2000, a lot of people were saying that it wasn't real and that we'd cooked the books. Then in the second year, the figures were confirmed. In the third year, they were improved, so they had to recognize what they didn't want to believe in the first place.
I remember some people even half-jokingly saying he should be appointed Prime Minister of Japan.
Je dirais, bien sûr, je n'y suis pas insensible.
Carlos is a sportsman, someone who likes to take on a challenge. He'll start climbing at a certain rate, then he'll go higher, then go higher again. He'll still be breathing, and he'll keep on going. Climbing is part of his DNA.
Carlos Ghosn was born in the Amazonian forest, but moved to Beirut at the age of 6 with his mother and older sister. It was like going back to his roots. Carlos Ghosn's grandfather, Bishara Ghosn, had left Lebanon some 50 years earlier to seek his fortune in Brazil. The Ghosn family, of Maronite Christian faith, settled in the district of Ashrafiyeh, the stronghold of the Christian community in the east of the city. But George, Carlos Ghosn's father, did not accompany them. Carlos knew nothing about the troubles of this man he hardly knew. On April 22, 1960, diamond trafficker Georges Ghosn was arrested for the assassination of a clergyman, an accomplice and smuggler between Africa and Europe, who threatened to reveal everything to the authorities. At the end of his trial, Georges Ghosn was sentenced to death. His sentence was eventually commuted to 15 years in prison.
The bus picked me up at 7:03 a.m. That was the exact time. And we arrived at Jamor at 7:30 a.m. This was the Collège des Pères Jésuites, historically the most renowned elementary and secondary school for boys. Back then, it was a boys' school, a place of excellence, designed to train future elites. The educational tradition of the school is to awaken the intelligence, to help shape the will, and to open the mind to charity. The objective was indeed to work in order to become free and responsible men. Up to 9th grade, Carlos Ghosn was an average student at best, and rather troublesome. He exerted a kind of fascination amongst those around him. That's what I felt about him, because he presented himself as a leader and had this ability to speak easily. Carlos was extremely focused as a boy. When he had a goal, he would do whatever was necessary to achieve that goal. In 11th grade, we were the very best of friends. And just before the first part of the Lebanese baccalaureate, classes stopped for a month so we could revise for the exams. He went to a monastery, but not with me. And this was where he first gave me a lesson in his pragmatism and focus. And I took it very badly at the time. I thought it was a form of betrayal. When he decided at the age of 18 to go to prep school in Paris, he was in a minority. He wanted to go to an Ivy League school, and that required prep classes, and prep classes required him to leave right away.
The Lebanese are very community-oriented, welcoming. They're hospitable. So when you go from Beirut to Paris, especially when you arrive in the fall, the not very sunny months, you arrive in this place that's more neutral, less warm. So it's a little tough. I took the exams for all the top French schools. There was a very clear hierarchy, and I was aiming for Polytechnique, and I got in. I was very happy.
Mademoiselle Chopinet Anne, Mademoiselle Combelle Françoise.
I was struck how French culture can generate some very different profiles. I could already see the two sides of France. The France that is kind of closed in on itself, and then the conquering, confident, greedy France.
The class I was in, class of 74, the same one as Carlos, had about 250 people in it.
The Latin Quarter, very nice place to be. No responsibilities, nothing to worry about. There were bars all around the school. It was the era of pinball machines.
And Carlos soon emerged as a pretty good pinball player, who, as we used to say, knew how to massage the machine. He had the reputation of an inveterate flirt. He behaved like someone who was out to seduce.
Those were great student years. People go to university or college because they're looking for autonomy. That's what every young person is looking for. Autonomy in terms of what they do, in terms of their career, financial autonomy. Not many people were interested in business. It really struck me because that was all I was interested in. I was struck by the lack of interest in the private sector, in business. I wanted to do something that involved technology and where I could deal with people. I'm interested in transforming reality, so naturally, I was drawn to industry.
He had this international vision of his future. When he started looking at companies that might recruit him, he picked Michelin, because Michelin was a multinational, and at the time Carlos joined the firm, Michelin had great ambitions in Brazil.
I loved cars, and when Michelin became an option, there was a connection with cars. And then there was Brazil, the chance to work abroad, in industry, so it was a good starting point. We were hired by class. I had a lot of friends who came from all the top schools, and we all ended up there together.
I remember Carlos Ghosn very well. He arrived at the same time as me. We arrived on the same day. And he stood out, both for his sense of humor and for his incisive and quick diagnosis of a situation.
I felt confident in Clermont-Ferrand. I knew a lot of people there who looked after me, people I had confidence in. I had only one dream, to go to Brazil. Instead, I went to Cholet as head of manufacturing. Then afterwards, I was parachuted in as director of the Le Prix plant. I was the youngest plant manager at Michelin.
I joined Michelin in 1980, and Carlos had already been there for 2 years. I had to do some work experience with him. He was this young civil engineering boss. He was at the time, I think, 26 or 27 years old. A plant manager, which for Michelin was kind of a big deal. At 27, he looked young. He was already settled in, but he was really young.
But I was the alien. I was this Lebanese-Brazilian graduate of Polytechnique, and I was only 27. For those workers at the Le Puy factory, I was an object of curiosity.
In that job, you're managing between 300 to 700 people. This is not a job you give to a kid. It's something you give to an old hand.
As the boss of the factory, you're always in the workshop. I've never had any difficulty working with people of any caliber, any position, or any education. I've never had a problem with that. I'd eat with my coworkers. We might go and have a drink after work. We'd eat sausages at 8 a.m. with a glass of red wine, and I liked that. I liked it because I believe that the factory is the place where you get technology, people, and product. It all blends together. I found that fascinating, how things are transformed. All the expertise of a company is right there.
I was in my 4th year in management at Michelin when Roger Porte, who was the boss of the Michelin factories in France, made an appointment to come and see me in my office. He said that amongst the Brazilians who had been hired, there was one who had been at the Polytechnique, and that he should come work with me to find out about my methods.
I got along with him. We had a lot in common. I'm a manufacturer and he's a finance guy.
I was his personal business school, if I may say so.
He showed me a realistic, human, and tactical side to finance.
It was no nonsense. You can't say, oh, well, we're not making any money now, but we will in 10 years, and so on. It's about dealing with reality. That's what I taught him. That's when I spoke to Carlos Ghosn about Brazil.
He was very worried about the situation there, and he was the one who said, we need someone young who knows Brazil and who doesn't apply traditional practices to save our business in Brazil. Against the advice of the other executives who all said, you're crazy, the guy's barely 30 years old. But the situation was so worrying that François Michelin finally said, all right, send him. 2 plantations, a tire plant, and a steel plant. At 31, it was a dream for me. Plus, it was a challenge, so I could make a difference. I was fired up to go to Brazil.
When he became the boss of Brazil, he was the boss of Brazil. There was nobody else. He was the boss.
It's always good when people are afraid because fear is the beginning of wisdom.
He has that autocratic side to him. But you need that when you're under fire, when it's coming at you from all sides.
When people are afraid, there's no more fantasizing. They respect skill, they pay attention, and they don't get in your way.
He's a worker, and when he gets his teeth into something, he's totally focused. He's brilliant at analysis. He works very fast. He has an ability to synthesize, so he quickly gets right to the heart of the matter and never gets tangled up in the details.
You have to move very quickly. You need to act very fast because things happen very fast, and you can run into a wall very fast.
He draws up the action plan. What are we doing on Monday morning? And what do we start with?
I had a good team, too. I made sure I had a good team around me. We set up an extremely efficient operation.
And a fourth, very important point, he communicates very clearly about what he wants to do. And with those 4 things, you have the winning formula that is Carlos Ghosn.
We got through it, and the people back in Clermont were impressed. When you're down to the wire, you need to shift your priorities, to stop and to explain. Brazil was an extraordinary education in terms of speed and changing direction.
In Brazil, he became a boss.
François Michelin took a special interest in Carlos Ghosn because he saw in him someone with considerable potential for development. He acted a bit like how you'd act for your own children.
When he visited Brazil, it was his first time there. So I took him to some key places in terms of Brazilian culture and history. I think he enjoyed it very much. And my relationship with François Michelin was very strongly influenced by that trip.
I would say that Francois saw Carlos as a son. A son.
The day he told me that he was thinking of asking me to take over the management of Michelin in North America, especially given the acquisition of Uniroyal BF Goodrich, that was a very big deal for me. And it was also a big surprise because things were happening so fast.
Babindom is the Michelin mascot, the French firm. The leader in Europe is now competing with Goodyear for the world #1 spot in the tire sector, following the acquisition of its U.S. competitor Uniroyal for just under 10 billion francs.
Carlos is a guy who will never tell you, we did something stupid, we paid too much. He'd say, listen, I need to do this. The roof's not in great shape and I have to redo half of it. He went into factories that were in a terrible state. Everything had to be done over. And he'd say, let's just get on with it. It was a challenge, a horrible challenge, because it was a real poison chalice in the industry. I told him, you're going to have to close a lot of factories. But that didn't scare him.
WEAU-TV Eau Claire. This is News Center 13 at 10 with Cindy Schott and Mike Rindo.
Eau Claire's largest private employer, the Uniroyal Goodrich plant, announced it plans to close down.
The closure will affect 1,300 workers.
We tell each other, and he certainly told himself, that the American market was ruthless. If we hadn't done it, we wouldn't have done a job that involved closing factories. We didn't enjoy it. Nobody enjoys it. Somebody else would have done it instead, and they might have done it very differently.
François Michelin was not a man who was particularly ruthless in terms of business. He was a great humanist. When there were losses, he was extremely sad that we had to make difficult decisions regarding individuals, either in terms of salaries or layoffs. With him, you had to proceed with a great deal of moderation. He was very sensitive to that. I was pushing, I would say, in a way. And that's what he expected from me.
In North America, they called him the cost killer, because it took considerable energy to cut costs that the market was not ready to accept.
When we hear news like this, indeed when we report it, it is all too easy to sanitize it by boiling it down to numbers and reasons for what's happened.
Cost killers aren't popular, but it's the economic reality of a globalized industry.
Those years in the U.S. made me grow up a lot. There was a before America and an after America. After spending 7 years in the U.S., I was much tougher.
And remember to lend a helping hand where we can. This will not be an easy time for anyone. Thank you, and good night.
Good night.
Then the headhunting began. He didn't leave of his own accord. A headhunting firm came to reel him in.
He said he needed to see me. He needed an answer and he couldn't talk over the phone.
We wrote it all on the board to work out what kind of company it might be. What industry? Maybe Airbus. I was there when he told him, and it was brutal. He had this filial attachment to Francois. He was very emotional when he told Francois. He was on the verge of tears.
François Michelin reacted more emotionally, wondering what he'd done to me. He didn't understand. I don't think it was a betrayal. Maybe a little ungrateful. But then again,
We went out in Clermont-Ferrand to eat some couscous. That was his farewell party. He didn't even have a proper one.
In 1996, I decided to recruit a number two. In terms of results, Renault was going through a difficult time financially back then.
I went to see Louis Schweitzer at the Renault headquarters. Louis Schweitzer is looking for a number two. So if you play your cards right, not only do you get to work in the car business, but you could also become the boss of Renault one day. It's an important job interview, so you're going to be a little tense. But he quickly put me at ease.
The first thing you ask someone you're interested in employing is what they have achieved in their life. And his achievements were quite impressive.
He asked me a lot of questions about what I did at Michelin, how things went there.
He mentioned that he'd lived in the US and that he had managed a merger there.
Obviously, he made an effort to help me feel more relaxed.
He's an intelligent person. There are a lot of those out there. But he had this vital energy, this amazing intensity, in his look, his attitude, his way of problem solving.
I was the right man to help with globalization. I could help boost the company's performance. It wasn't a particularly tough decision.
Love at first sight implies emotions that I didn't feel at the time.
No, I didn't feel that. He's not a very expressive man.
Maybe a professional crush?
If you like.
Renault is not just any old company. It means something. It has a history, a culture, and it has made its mark. It's part of the history of France. It might not be perfect, but it's a company with a personality, and one that inspires a great deal of emotion.
He was welcomed openly, and people recognized his qualities. He never fully belonged to the group, but it must be said that he listened a lot and tried to learn very quickly. And it seemed that Carlos Ghosn certainly felt superior to most of the others. It's a delicate balance. It's about rigor. How does one regulate rigor? Not enough? Too much? Well, he has a lot, and a lot can become too much. When he exercises authority, it's abrupt. You have that, and then, boom.
Good management is about getting the people around you to do things they don't want to do, but making sure that they end up doing them and are then proud they did them. Management is not about walking into a situation where everything is fine and where you don't change a thing. You don't need a manager for that. You need an administrator.
He set up a series of so-called transversal teams to assess savings opportunities. And he came up with a plan to save $20 billion in 3 years, which seemed both ambitious and reasonable to me.
I made a whole bunch of proposals. Louis Schweitzer picked what he wanted. I'll take this, not that, I'll change that. And then it became his plan.
I concluded that I had to close a factory, the one in Vilvoorde.
Des ouvriers qui traversent une frontière pour manifester leur colère, l'image est pour le moins inhabituelle. Ces 8 à 900 Belges, chômeurs en sursis, savent pourtant que leur sortie est désespérée. La direction de Renault l'a confirmé, elle ne reviendra pas sur la fermeture de Vilvoorde.
It's painful to close a factory, especially because it was a factory made up of good people, people who worked hard. For the people who worked in that factory, it was total injustice.
When you're competing with countries for which the priority is economic and the social side is less important, if you think a company's priority should be increasingly socially oriented, there's a price to pay. There are countries that accept that. I understand and I respect it. But for me, That was the big lesson I learned from the 20 billion plan. We could have gone further, but we didn't. And after 2 years, I was getting impatient because I thought we were moving too slowly and that we were too soft. But the thing that totally cemented my relationship with Renault was the arrival of Nissan.
Hanawa-san, goshukai arigatou gozaimasu. Kabunushi no minasama hajimemashite, Carlos Ghosn desu. Smile! Thank you very much for your cooperation.
Of course, after the success of Nissan, I never imagined for a second that Carlos Ghosn wouldn't come back to Renault.
And then it was agreed that I would be the chief executive of both companies.
Pour moi, la transition aujourd'hui est une transition heureuse, dans de bonnes mains. Nous avions convenu donc.
We agreed that when he took over at Renault, he would appoint a CEO at Nissan. And he said to me at that time, and I remember it quite well, that the person he'd been considering wasn't quite up to his expectations and he needed more time.
There wasn't a choice between me and someone else. I was the natural choice, the one they wanted to head up Renault. And they accepted that I would run both companies. That's how it happened.
If anyone could do it, it was him. But I think that even he couldn't do it.
Je suis très heureux de revenir en France pour prendre la présidence d'une entreprise innovante, enthousiaste comme Renault.
I realized after a while that this hadn't even been considered.
In 2005, Ghosn became CEO of Renault, CEO of Nissan, and chairman of the board of Nissan. He was managing operations for 2 companies, 10,000 kilometers apart, and with an 8-hour time difference, with factories and plants all over the world and on every continent. He was the embodiment of a citizen of the world.
During his 14 years in charge at Renault, Carlos Ghosn totally transformed the French company. He accelerated its globalization and outsourcing. And over time, Carlos Ghosn's Renault pulled away from France. Redundancies followed redundancies, and the number of French employees decreased by 30%. At the same time, Renault increased sales and profitability by nearly 60%, from 2.5 million vehicles sold to nearly 4 million.
I needed to shake Renault up a little, because I thought Renault was only tapping a very small fraction of its potential.
L'image de marque de Renault. Toutes les enquêtes montrent qu'elle s'est affaiblie au cours des dernières années. Renault n'est pas en crise, mais Renault reste fragile.
La dimension sociale et sociétale.
Carlos Ghosn was not interested in the social and societal dimension of the company, in the social role of a brand like Renault. What mattered was the bottom line, and nothing more.
L'entreprise va très bien, Monsieur Ghosn l'a annoncé, les résultats sont plus que corrects, mais pour atteindre son fameux 6% de marge opérationnelle, il est prêt à mettre 1000 personnes à la rue.
I got a lot of criticism because I represented the international development of Renault.
Nous n'avons pas investi 150 millions d'euros pour qu'en même temps, nous apprenions qu'on va réaliser une nouvelle Clio en Turquie.
I've never been very good at playing politics, as you know. That's never been my line of work. But I've never been the boss just of Renault. And so, of course, I had less time to go and convince everyone in France of the legitimacy of my strategy. And I was forced to reduce the intensity of my efforts in both Nissan and Renault. I didn't go on presidential trips. I didn't travel with them. They would say, he's not showing up. He's not interested.
He was the boss of one of France's biggest companies, but he wasn't a boss-type person. He was thought of as someone quite out of the ordinary. No one in top management circles wanted to be around him. No one wanted to associate with him or promote him, to put him forward. And behind all this was this slightly flamboyant side, a bit of a braggart, a bit take it or leave it. He's like, tell me what to do, and I'll do it. But he wonders, why don't they like me?
With regard to his compensation and everything to do with money, Carlos Ghosn was adamant about the amounts.
Every single time I go to the shareholder, I start by answering the question about my compensation. It becomes some kind of ritual. You kind of have to come to say, this is my compensation, and that's the way it has been calculated, and these are the reference.
He was particularly sensitive about this subject, and he controlled the message more than anyone else.
There is a fight for global talent, and for fight of global talent, money should not be a handicap, it should be an asset.
In 2009, the Japanese discovered how much he was being paid, which at the time was 7 times higher than that of his competitor, the boss of Toyota. And the Japanese said, so this gaijin, this foreigner, comes in to save Nissan, but he's picking up a fat check for doing it.
In Japan, when a boss earns more than $1 million, it's considered too much.
The man who once passed for the perfect son-in-law started to behave like he was on a different planet. And that was shocking. It was shocking in Japan.
At Nissan, we wondered why he was so greedy when he was already receiving a very good salary. But we didn't live in the same world, and we ended up thinking it was normal.
Given his background and the position he held, it didn't seem unusual to me, as a financial journalist, that he earned over $8 million.
A company boss is a value creator, and if he doesn't create value, you should fire him. It's not a job where you get a 4-year contract. No way. If you create value, the shareholders can see that, and you have to be paid accordingly. It's a global marketplace. The reason you get paid $1 million, $4 million, or $6 million is because that's the market rate. In France, the boss of a company is seen as an administrator. That's how I was considered. It was even implied that I was a public employee because the French state has a 15% stake in Renault. So how dare I give myself such a high salary?
We felt he was only working for himself and the shareholders.
Personne ne peut comprendre que dans une entreprise dont l'État est actionnaire, le patron de celle-ci augmente sa rémunération qui atteint 764 fois la valeur du SMIC.
He knew it was a sensitive subject.
We heard people in the company saying that they were being asked to make an effort, while top management was doing anything but. And the proof was Carlos Ghosn's salary, which had become ludicrous. It was on a different scale. He wasn't ever coming down to earth because he was being paid so much.
I was, in fact, doing a lot of jobs. I was chairman of the board of Renault and CEO of Renault. I was chairman of the board of Nissan and CEO of Nissan, and chairman of the board of Mitsubishi, and president of the Alliance. People were saying, it's Versailles, the monarchy, and Louis XIV. Who does he think he is? But for foreigners, that's not what Versailles represents. For them, it's the symbol of French genius, French influence around the world. And for me, as the boss of Renault, The image I want to present is a victorious France. If a long-distance runner says he's happy being in the top 10, he's not putting in the same effort he would if he wanted to be number 1. People said I was obsessed by that. That's not true at all. But I do say that if you become number 1, it's because you deserve it, not because you want it.
Earlier today, Nissan completed the acquisition of a 34% equity stake in Mitsubishi Motors.
People were amazed the day we became number 1 in the world with Renault, Nissan, and Mitsubishi.
And Mitsubishi Motors becomes a full partner in the alliance.
In February 2018, President Macron asked Carlos Ghosn to renew his contract as CEO of Renault one last time. But there was a requirement. Carlos Ghosn must merge Renault and Nissan once and for all. For Nissan and the Japanese government, this was a declaration of war. At the same time, within Nissan, and unbeknownst to Carlos Ghosn, an investigation started into his compensation and capital movements from which he might have benefited.
In 2018, I wasn't sure about renewing my contract with Renault.
Les résultats du groupe Renault en 2017 affichent un niveau record de chiffre d'affaires, de profit. Après être allé mieux, le groupe Renault va désormais bien. Fier de mon
I was proud of my track record, and I was thinking perhaps it was time to hand it over.
What could have justified 4 more years at that time? Certainly the perks of being at the top were at stake.
He was thinking about another year or two, but he knew it was going to end. He knew that.
I really hesitated. I talked about it a lot with my wife, and I have to say, my children didn't want me to sign up again. They had it right when they said it was over.
I advised him to stay because I thought there was still a lot to do.
Given the insistence from Renault's board and from the French state, I unfortunately allowed myself to be convinced to stay for another term.
Fait convaincre de repartir pour un autre mandat. Morning, how are you? Yeah. Anything special we need to feature? Il était entendu que je me concentrerai sur l'alliance.
I would focus on the alliance in order to strengthen the convergence of the 3 companies and create an integrated group.
Un groupe intégré, pas fusionné,
not merged, but integrated with 3 autonomous entities.
I fundamentally believe that at that moment he said to himself, I'll do it, and only I can do it.
It started in January or February 2018. The Japanese wanted a trust. The French state didn't want a trust. They wanted a merger. Discussions started, and they couldn't agree on anything.
This was not acceptable. If we merged the management of Renault and Nissan completely, it would mean that Renault and Nissan would become one company. And as a result, Renault would have taken complete control of Nissan. That was not acceptable. They figured that by eliminating Ghosn, the merger project would be stopped, at least for a while, and his despotism would be stopped as well.
We didn't see him anymore. Well, I never saw him anymore. His diary was too full between the alliance, Renault, and Nissan. It was too much for one man.
Is it possible that when you've made a success of absolutely everything since you were 16 years old, then that can make you lose your sense of reality? Yes, it certainly is possible.
It must have been difficult to tell Carlos Ghosn that you didn't agree with him. I think some distance started to be felt. I could feel it.
He's not the only one. Many people at some point are tempted to say to themselves, I'm right. So why are we wasting our time with this when I'm right?
When you are successful, and Renault-Nissan was successful, it's very difficult to question the way you operate. It's almost inhuman, in fact.
So every day they don't start is a good day for us.
And that's why I think it's good to know when to leave.
And it's mass marketed. That means you're going to...
10 years was too long. It was time to go because the abuse was starting.
Ghosn was sitting on his throne and he loved it. But his manipulations became known, and his denunciation came from inside Nissan itself.
Every 2 years, we do what we call major risk mapping. What could prevent the company from reaching the objectives it has set itself? We imagine being in 2028. With Renault no longer existing, Renault is dead. So how could that have happened? In terms of major risks, there was the risk of Ghosn disappearing. What would happen if Ghosn disappeared? It was a major risk that could ruin everything, and everyone had identified it. Ghosn had become a major vulnerability for the company. Ghosn was a major risk factor for the group. I discussed it a lot with him. And I told him that if something happened to him, we had to have a succession plan in place. And he'd say, not my problem. The committee thingamajig would handle it.
His biggest mistake was thinking he was irreplaceable. That was Carlos Ghosn's greatest problem.
I saw him in Paris a month or so before his arrest. He was walking on water. Everything's fine. Everything's working. He told me, I'm like a god in Japan. It is incredible. That was 4 weeks earlier. So bravo, Carlos.
I'm furious about his naivety. How could he have not seen it coming?
After 4 months of pretrial detention in a Tokyo prison, Carlos Ghosn was released on bail and placed under house arrest. 10 months later, while preparing for his trial, he decided to flee Japanese justice and arranged his escape to Lebanon. After an incredible breakout, allegedly hiding in a musical instrument case stowed on board a business jet, and to everyone's surprise, Carlos Ghosn landed in Beirut on December 30th, 2019, 14 months after his arrest in Tokyo. Japan has requested his extradition from Lebanon. Carlos Ghosn's trial may now never take place.